For that frames my own experience and how I interpret what's going on. Um, for those of you who are not Scottish, our history is very complex, full of contrasts, very highs, great highs and great achievements and terrible lows. And, you know, we've really had a difficult time trying to assert ourselves and our own independent spirit. And at times we've had to make compromises and we have had to meet our neighbours in a spirit of conciliation. It's not always been easy, but sometimes it's worked, and it's worked to both our benefit. I'd like to go to a particular story from my own family, and it gives me some pride to tell you this story. When we were growing up in the East End of Glasgow, we had, like any family there, we had to cope with the difficulties that Glasgow had. Glasgow is a city of immigrants. There are many immigrants from all over the world. It has a big Irish community from Ireland. They are mostly Roman Catholic and make up about 30% of the East End and north side of the city, stretching out to the towns in the Clyde Valley, I should say. And then we had Polish and Italian immigrants also, and the Scots, traditional Scots have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, are also a mixed group. You know, they're not a pure race. And that has been very much the west of Scotland's story. My father, one night when I was 9 years old, had been out coming home from work, and he had to catch a bus from Townhead. Townhead in Glasgow. It was, as the name suggests, it was an area for catching buses and having a quick beer and chatting to friends. And my dad liked to gamble a little bit, so he would go to the bookies and put on a bet. It was a very traditional working class thing for working class men to do, and it was an escape for him. But one night he was coming late. It was a Friday night, and he had arrived a little bit later than normal by about 40 minutes, and my mother was a little bit nervous. It was just myself. My brother had not been born. And then he was pale, a little bit pale when he came in, and he had had a drink. And he sat down, and we asked him what had happened. And he said that a man had been assaulting a woman at a bus stop and punching her, kicking her, spitting on her, really being awful. And he had intervened, and he had separated the man and had to jostle with him. And it turned into a fracas. People were getting away from the bus station, and the girl was screaming. Fortunately, in those days, the police were near at hand, because during that time, so this is 1964, there were a lot of police on the beats. And the Glasgow police are, they're a pretty firm reputation, because they had to deal with problems and issues. Glasgow itself, although it's a beautiful city, has had a big shadow over itself, over crime, violence, drunkenness, this kind of thing. And so the police intervened and separated my father. And my father, I think he'd given the guy a good punch. I'm not sure, he didn't go into the details. But as he was separated, the policeman, the sergeant, came over and said, well, thanks for intervening, but that was actually a very dangerous thing to do, because this person, this guy that you've pushed and punched, he's a well-known Glasgow gangster, and he could have razored you. So what did that mean? So in those days they used an open razor, which was a blade, and it meant that my father would have had a big scar down his face. So of course my mum was shocked and said, "Oh, Jim, you shouldn't have done that." I said, "Well, I had to." He says he was beating her up and I had to intervene, and I stopped it. And you know what? I was proud of him, because he stood up for what was right. His heart told him, no, I have to go in and stop this. Later on, we had another issue, and this time, again, it relates to violence in Glasgow. Um, this was when we lived in Onslow Drive. We lived in a ground floor flat, and it only had it was a modest apartment. It had a small garden at the front. The neighbours were nice. There was I remember an artist next door and a teacher upstairs. So it was it was an okay neighbourhood. But behind Onslow Drive was a Catholic estate, and there the people were, I would say, they were poor. They were poor Irish immigrants, and they had come over to Ireland. Sorry, come over from Ireland in the 1870s and the 1840s, and again after and before the First World War, and they'd settled for jobs that some of the Scots Protestants didn't want to do. Things like navving, digging up roads, clearing rubbish, very, jobs that were considered low quality jobs. And they tended to have big families, and I remember most of the children had red hair, and they were very good at their children in the Catholic community were very good at climbing and jumping and doing somersaults from walls, and they were really tough and hardy. We didn't talk to them, and they didn't talk to us. So they were only about 70 meters distance from us. However, one night I was sitting with my mum, and my father was out working in D.C. Thompson's again. He was a machinist for the newspapers, and he was lifting a printing press to enable the prints to be run, and it meant that he would come in after the Sunday press was prepared. He would come in late in the morning, about 4 o'clock. But that night, while he was out at work, we were sitting quietly in the kitchen, and the kitchen windows, they had wooden shutters, so my mum closed the shutters. Again, this was before my brother was born, so I think it was about the same time as the other incident. And as we were sitting there just having tea, and I had been out playing, suddenly a spear came through the window, smashed the glass, came through the wooden shutters and hit the wall and dropped down. And it had been thrown with such force. So I went and I picked it up, and it was sharpened. So it wasn't actually a spear, it was a railing that had been sharpened to a spike. And my mother almost collapsed in fright. I turn now to today. The news is awful. It's at points you can't watch it because it brings me back to my memory of almost being killed, or my mother being killed, but getting out of it and escaping from it, and it's just a one-off. It didn't happen again. But every day we're exposed to children being murdered and tortured, and people seemingly to take delight in it, and politicians not even criticizing it. They're watching their political base or their sponsors, or oh well, if I say this will happen and we won't get this agreement. And so this torture of children is going on, and both sides, without naming names at this point in the video, are at fault. It seems that children are just there as pawns to be disposed of. And it could be that one side is completely desperate, but another side doesn't care as long as it gets its political objectives. And I'm like you, sick of it, and I've had enough of it. And it's time for us to make a firmer protest and stance against it, whatever way you can find, whether it's writing to an MP or boycotting some goods, or thinking about changing your holiday plans, or approaching somebody of influence who's working for one of the major companies in the Middle East with Middle Eastern connections. There are ways for us to show our extreme displeasure about this. And I will now go back to Scottish history and Irish history. There's a famous leader from the Iona community called Adaman, and I just have to check my notes here. In 697 AD, so it's well over 1300 years ago, he held a synod, a church meeting, and dignitaries were asked to come, kings and queens of Ireland and Scotland, and also parts of North England were invited to come to this meeting, and it was to curtail violence and robbery and theft, murder, rape, etc., in that was occurring across Scotland, Ireland, and northern England. And it was called the Synod of Birr, 697 AD, and Adaman, who was one of the leaders who is said to have called this synod, this important meeting, came out with a law called Lex Innocentium, meaning law of the innocents. And I think that he was reforming the Arthurian code of chivalry and honour and laws of warfare that had come and gone, over the years, sometimes being successful for a period of time and then falling away again. And he was successful, and the law was reinstated, and the law was adopted by the Irish, the Dariatic Scots, the Picts of Northern Scotland, and the Northumbrian English. And the law was very basic. Churchmen, churchwomen had to be respected and not violated. Women and children were sacred and not to be used in warfare, kidnapped, tortured, sold as slaves. Although some slavery did still go on after this, it didn't stop completely. And it helped to establish the later medieval code of chivalry. Now we come on to this time. It seems that the Geneva Conventions have been totally ignored. Or if you look at the recent voting for the ceasefire in Gaza, all the Conservative MPs in November, apart from 4, did not vote for a ceasefire. And yet there is the evidence all around us. You can't even watch anymore. Think of a 7-year-old child. Her house collapses on top of her. Her brothers and sisters and parents are dead. She's lying in blood, terrible pain in her own toilet. She's lying maybe for 48 hours crying. Nobody hears her. Nobody comes to her help. And then they pull out this bedraggled body. Later on, wrap her up in a shroud and bury her with another massive casualties. And maybe she'll be fortunate if her grave's not disturbed, but maybe a bulldozer come along and bulldoze up the graves and the bodies will be thrown out. Or on the other side, the Jewish girl who's captured and possibly tortured by gangsters that came in after Hamas on that dreadful day. Her body was dragged through the back of a truck by other Gazan groups, spat on and beat with sticks. She's dead, she's naked. How disgusting is that? It's in the same category. And so, having said this and talked about my own experience, It's time for this to stop, and it's time for us to be much firmer. It's time to see a little bit of manliness. You know, virilis, vera, that Indo-European word that's right throughout the Persian, the Latin, Spanish, French, English, Gaelic languages. It's time to stop. And so, with this, first of all, this says Gaza gangsters. And you're the first to go. Zionism. It's a fake philosophy, and Jewish people, for God's sake, waking up. You're being dragged into this. You need to find a better way. This is not going to work, and it's going to come back on you very, very bitterly if it doesn't stop. ISIS, another fake group made up by, I suspect, fake intelligence agencies. Yes, corrupt intelligence agencies. And I've already said, and I pointed this out many times, and I've been laughed at, and people will not speak to me about it, and relatives will ignore me, friends will ignore me. There was a power, and still is a power, behind the scenes. They want us to be divided. They want us to kill each other. It's easy for them, come on. You know, you play one group off against another, and then take control. Why? Because our planet is so rich in resources. That's why. And they can offer us technology, and they can offer another group technology and say, hey, this group's getting this, don't you want that? If you want that, you have to do this for us. So, corrupt intelligence agencies, they also go. I hope things will improve next year. We can only try, but we need to speak out. We need to speak up. We need to come out into the open, and we need to speak about it and not hide away. We need to talk about this. We need to find a way forward for everybody. Do we want a regional war to break out in the Middle East? Think, those of you who maybe don't have kids or don't have children, just think at the cost it's going to cost. It will bring to Britain. We're already in economic and financial difficulty. Just think of a sudden spike in oil prices, or the fact that we can't get hold of some things because they can't come through the Red Sea, or they're being attacked by the Houthi rebels. And trouble's going to get worse. So, please, if you're in a position of authority and influence, we need to change this around. And I'm sure most of you watching this will agree with me in your hearts. So do something about it. This is just coming up to the new year. I wish you a happy new year. Another video will follow soon. Thank you.